They say betrayal hurts most when it comes from family. But nothing prepared me for the moment my own husband's insult slipped out of our daughter's innocent mouth. In that instant, the safe world I thought I had built cracked open, leaving me exposed at my own din. The evening had started with an air of the kind of routine that almost lulled me into believing everything in my life. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and earth, the kind of comforting scent, the clinking of silverware against steady rhythm, and my daughter's laughter as she tried to balance, looking across the table, sitting tall, smiling in that. To an outsider, it might have looked like the portrait of a perfect American family, but inside me, something wasn't resting. For weeks, as if some truth was waiting for it, and reminded myself, I told myself no, but deep down, I already knew calm rarely lasts. Daniel leaned slightly, his voice low and his lips barely moved, pathetic, and so casual that the word landed inside me. My fork hovered midair, or if my mind was, her words echoed, and then she laughed, as though she had. In that instant, the calm shattered into the room seemed to tilt, and all I could hear was that my eyes darted toward, searching for that he might undo the damage he had. But instead, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't a miss. It was intentional. Humiliation, hot and red, and I felt my skin prickle as if a spotlight had been turned on me in my own dining room. There was nowhere to hide from the weight of that word now that it had been spoken aloud, carried by my daughter's innocent laughter. I wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear from the table, to escape the suffocating embarrassment pressing down on. I forced a smile I didn't feel, the kind of brittle smile that aches in your sweetheart, I said softly, trying to steady. That's not a nice. My daughter looked up at me, her little brow furrowed, his expression the that silent exchange exactly what he was daring me to. His words carried the embarrassment. How dare he plan? How dare he reduce and let her carry the. I wanted to scream, to tear the mask of charm, to make him understand, but my voice caught. Sadness followed. It wasn't just sadness for me. It was sadness for me. For the innocent. Every shift in my daughter went back to aware that some. Daniel sat back. Shame spread through me, whispering that I had, that my silence had, that my fear of breaking. I hated myself. But even as the shifted, I wasn't just embarrassed anymore. I was awake. Awake to the truth that this wasn't love. Awake to the danger of letting my daughter grow up believing that this was how a husband spoke to a wife, how a father spoke about a mother. Awake to the possibility that I could no longer keep I set my fork down, my hand trembling slightly, and forced myself to look him straight in the eye. For a second, the words trembled on my lips, ready to spill out, ready to challenge. But then I glanced at my daughter, her wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't need a war at her dinner table. Not yet. So instead, I smiled thinly, masking the storm inside. Maybe we'll save dessert. My voice sounded calm, steady even, but inside me, Daniel leaned back in his chair. He had won. As I cleared the plates that, in once broken whispered insult, people envied us. But illusions are the night of the me, long after, and the silence of our cruel whisper. Daniel and I used to feel proud, wearing their I thought it meant untouchable. Our beginning was a Daniel had been he remembered little things, the way I couldn't, how I hummed when how nervous I he treated those quirks, things that made me unique. I had never felt so seen. He proposed on a cool spring evening, beneath twinkling lights strung across his parents. I thought I had won the kind of love most women only. Marriage started just as beautifully. We moved into a modest home with creaky floors and a small porch, and we filled it with our laughter. I remember evenings when we would sit outside with glasses of wine, talking about the future we were building together. We made plans, vacations we would take, a family we would grow, traditions we would start. When our daughter was born, I felt as though every piece had clicked into place. She was the embodiment of our love, proof that the fairy tale I believed in had taken root in reality. But illusions rarely break all at once. They fracture slowly, quietly, until the cracks spread so wide you can no longer pretend they aren't. Looking back, I realized those cracks had been forming long. It began with subtle changes. Daniel no longer Instead, he began to roll. If I stumbled while telling a story, he would finish it for me, turning my mistake into a joke At first, I convincing myself, but somewhere deep inside, I told myself that this was just. I had grown so invested in the image of I refused to let the dismissive grew bolder with time. He began making snide remarks about. His words were rarely loud. They didn't need to. They were whispered just loud enough, sharp enough, subtle enough. I never dared to call him. The more he dismissed me, the more embarrassed I, not only in front of him, but in front of myself. How could I, the woman everyone envied, be so small in my own? The first true crack came one evening when we were at a dinner party with close friends. I was telling a story, something funny about our daughter, and I stumbled over a detail. Daniel jumped in, finishing it for me, but instead of laughing with me, he made me the joke. His words weren't cruel in the obvious, but they dripped with condescension. Everyone laughed, and I forced myself to laugh too, but humiliation burned so hot in my chest. Later, when I tried to tell him how it made me, he brushed me off with a smirk. "You're overreacting," he said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Can't you take a joke?" That phrase haunted me for "Can't you take a joke?" It became his shield, his weapon of choice. Every time I pushed back, every time I tried to defend myself, he would dismiss me with those words, making me feel childish, fragile, weak. And every time I swallowed my protest, shame coiled tighter around me, convincing me that maybe I really was overreacting. But the dinner table moment with my daughter repeating his insult forced me to confront the truth I had. This wasn't harmless. This wasn't just teasing. This was a pattern, a carefully crafted erosion of who I was. The perfect marriage everyone believed in wasn't just cracked. It had been crumbling piece by piece for years while I painted over the fractures with a smile. Anger began to pulse beneath the sadness. Anger at him, yes, but also anger at myself. How many times had I allowed him to reduce me, to humiliate me, while I pretended it was nothing? How many times had I protected him, keeping up the illusion for friends and family while I silently absorbed the pain? I thought I was saving my marriage by staying quiet, but in reality, I was sacrificing myself on the altar of sadness and tension wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Nights in bed grew colder, not because of the temperature, but because it's between us. I would stare at the ceiling, listening to him breathe, wondering when the man I married. I longed for the version of him who once looked at me, but I knew that man was replaced by the shame of admitting this truth. I had been so proud of so proud to be the one who had done it right, who had found her, to admit that it was all an illusion. But shame I discovered, because in the pit of my despair, a whisper of empowerment began to rise. I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't obligated to keep. I began to see that my daughter, that a woman's voice, that it was normal to be believed. That realization shifted something. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about as I drifted between, and as the memory was darker than at first. An accident born, but deep down, I absorbed, waiting for the wrong moment to slip from her lips. I noticed it most during the calmest moments, the simple rituals of daily life when a child's innocence should shine brightest. She would play with her dolls in the living room, arranging them carefully around her, imitating conversation. I would smile, listening from the kitchen as she poured invisible tea and reminded her dolls to use their manners. But then, one afternoon, my smile faltered. In the same sing-song voice she used, she said to one of her dolls, "You can't even do that right. You're so useless." The words pierced through me. I froze mid-step, the dish towel clutched in my hand. That wasn't me. That wasn't something. I knew exactly where I stood there, hidden from her doll begging to be shock swept. It was one thing for Daniel to reduce me in ways but hearing those same patterns, this wasn't just about me anymore. His cruelty was spreading, seeping into the one place. When she caught me watching and asked if I wanted to, I forced a smile. As I picked up one of the dolls, humiliation, my own daughter was imitating her. She thought she was rehearsing the toxic embarrassment. It was one thing but using art, I thought of her and I realized that if I didn't stop her, she should accept. The thought made my blood run cold, but anger quickly gave way to sadness, heavy and suffering. I tucked her into bed that night, listening as she recited her prayers, her voice sweet, watching her innocence clash with the tears stung my eyes as I find a way to but even as I made that tension in our home, worried about what venom he might, I noticed to demand my daughter's innocence. I could ignore words, force me to. I couldn't let her childhood be. I couldn't let her grow. For her sake, that night, as I lay awake once more, I thought about I didn't have all the answers. I could no longer sit. Just as I was drifting toward her small voice, soft but Daddy says Mommy is, the words floating. My breath caught. This wasn't just, she was already repeating. And how much worse would it get? Whispers came after hearing my daughter repeat Daniel's words. I couldn't stop my mind from replaying all the moments I had brushed aside, the countless whispers that had slipped under my skin like tiny blades. For so long, I had convinced myself they were harmless, that he didn't mean them the way they sound. But with my daughter now echoing his cruelty, I was forced to face the truth. Those whispers had been shaping my reality, eroding me peace. In the calm light of morning, when Daniel left for work, and I thought back to the earth hidden so well, he would tease me, laughing as at first I found it endearing. Wasn't attached. The shift was so the criticisms, and the whispers started. I began to enter them, rehearsing my words. The calmness of our constant awareness, shock still. He had two faces, one for the world. In public, Daniel was quick to boast about my cook parenting. He painted me as the capable wife, the devoted mother, the woman he was proud. But the moment the audience was gone, his tone shifted. Behind closed doors, the whispers, "You're lucky I put up with you. No one else would want you. You really are pathetic." Humiliation was his weapon of, not the loud kind that would leave marks for others, but the quiet kind. He would lean close, say something cruel under his, and then smirk if I confronted him, he would raise his eyebrows in mock confusion. "What are you talking about?" That denial, that gaslight, was I really hearing? Was I so insecure that I was imagining? Embarrassment gnawed at me, and I hated how small. Around friends and family, I carried the weight to convince not. Marriage was still perfect. But the anger grew, hot and sharp. Every time I saw the smirk of satisfaction cross his face after one of his whispered attacks. He knew exactly what he was doing. He enjoyed watching me shrink, watching me swallow the pain rather than risk exposing him. And now, seeing our daughter repeat his words, I realized his cruelty wasn't just about me anymore. He was shaping her view of love, of respect, of womanhood. That thought ignited a fury I had never felt before. Sadness followed in waves, overwhelming me when I would be folding laundry, and suddenly tears would sting my eyes as I remembered a time when Daniel's words had lifted me up and I missed the man I thought who had once made me, but I knew now that man, a mask he wore, became unbearable. A long line of cuts. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, I found myself, something in me, but another voice. My hand slipped and I pulled it out. The handwriting and the words scrawled. My breath caught, whispered denial. Wasn't a slip. This was written proof he was willing to write, living with two. Versions of the same man felt like a prison. The note I found in his jacket pocket haunted me for days. The words "you make me sick" weren't whispered in anger or murmured under his breath where he could later deny them. They were written in his own hand, deliberate, permanent, undeniable. Seeing his thoughts inked out like that forced me to acknowledge the cruelty I had been pretending not to see. But as much as the words hurt, what made the pain even sharper was the way he carried himself around everyone else. To the outside world, Daniel was the perfect man. He was polite, quick with a joke, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. People gravitated toward him, laughed at his stories, admired his dedication to work and family. Neighbors waved when he mowed the lawn, co-workers praised his leadership, and friends often told me how lucky I was to have him. Sometimes, even my own parents would remind me of how rare it was to find a husband so reliable, so dependable. I would nod, smile, and say I knew, all the while choking on the weight of the truth. Because in private, when the audience was gone, his smile would, the warmth in his voice cooled into and the jokes turned into whispers sharp enough to the same man who shook hands and one leaned close inside, incompetent. It was as though he were one for the world, and the longer I lived between. At first, people would nudge me, but the moment and the door shut, "You embarrassed me." The humiliation, not just because everyone else, that embarrassment deepened with every compliment. When someone told me I was lucky, I wanted to scream. That the man they saw, I worried that after all, how could the world's golden anger simmered? He thrived on admiration. What if no one believed? What if they thought I was the bitter wife jealous? Charisma? That thought left me paralyzed, stuck between fury and silence. The sadness was heavier than the anger. I mourned the man I thought I had married, the man who had once made me feel safe and cherished. I missed the way he used to look at me with this, even if I now grieved not just for who saw him as the who played with her. How could I reconcile the two versions of in public, standing beside in private, I was the one who absorbed his bit, the duality of trapped in a play I had. Every time I smiled and suffocated, came a second skin, ashamed of the way I laughed, ashamed that I was allowed. I wondered what people would they pity me, judge me, or worse, dismiss me, as the fear of that judgment kept protecting his image. But within that shame, the longer I lived between masks can't eventually they, and when his did, I wanted to be the one who for the first time, people gathered around him like moths to a, and I stood nearby, wearing the mask, the supportive smiling wife. I laughed when I was supposed to, nodded at the right moments, all the while feeling. As the night wore on my way back, he was standing with one of his co-workers, his tone low and at first I assumed he was sharing some harmless but then I caught the words, clear and deliberate, whispered in the same tone he reserved only for me. "She's such a burden, a cruel edge." And for a moment I couldn't move. The shock froze me in place, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't whispered in the privacy of our home. This wasn't a secret only I carried. He had taken his cruelty into the open, hidden beneath the guise of casual conversation. If he was willing to whisper such things, how many more slipping through the cracks of his mask while I stood smiling beside. The day my little girl looked at me with his same mocking tone, I realized the damage had already begun. The moment at the party where I overheard Daniel whisper about me to his co-worker replayed in my head for days. It was the first time I knew for certain that his cruelty wasn't confined to the walls of our home. He had taken it outside, planting seeds of disrespect in the minds of others. But what haunted me even more was realizing he had already planted those same seeds, our daughter. It started in subtle ways, so small at first that I tried to brush them off. One evening, she was setting the table, carefully placing forks beside. When I dropped a spoon, she glanced at me, tilted her head with a smirk that looked eerily smooth move, Mommy. Her tone carried a mocking lilt. I laughed weakly, telling myself it was nothing, just a child imitating something but inside, I knew exactly where. Over time, the imitation, she would sigh dramatically, roll her eyes of mimic phrases once, when I struggled to, she crossed her little, Daddy says you're not. She laughed as if it were waiting for me had been ripped out from me. Shock washed over, hearing my daughter repeat, seeing her wear his expressions. He was supposed to be half of me, but his shadow loomed, her gestures, not to another but to a version of him. Time she mocked me, and the fact that was I so diminished in her? Was I teaching what was acceptable to? The thought was unbearable. Embarrassment sank. I found myself hiding the truth. When she parroted his words in front of others, I would laugh it off, saying kids repeat. But inside, I wanted to scream that these weren't just random phrases, that they were the product of years of whispered cruelty. Yet the mask I had worn for so long forced me to smiling on the outside while dying inside. Anger burned hotter with every passing. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from his poison, but I also wanted to rage at him into our battles. She was innocent, undeserving of the toxicity he spread so carelessly. Each time she repeated his words, my fury grew, not only at him but at myself for letting it go this far. The cycle was taking root in her, and I felt powerless to stop it. Sadness overwhelmed me when I looked at her sweet face so full of life, and wondered what kind of woman she would grow up to be. Discontinued. Would she believe that love meant tolerating insults? Would she think that being diminished was the price of being in a relationship? The idea that she might one day accept the same treatment I had endured made my chest ache with grief. The tension in our home became unbearable. I found myself overanalyzing every interaction, terrified of what she might repeat, what lessons she might. I watched her closely, looking for traces of my warmth, my kindness, afraid that they. And yet, even in the midst of that shame, a flicker of empowerment emerged. Seeing my daughter mirror his cruelty forced me to confront the urgency of my situation. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep swallowing my pain. She needed to see me fight, to see me reclaim my voice, to see that being a woman did not mean being. If I didn't act, the cycle would continue, and she would grow up believing it was. That realization gave. One night, as I tucked her, she looked up at me wide, earnest eyed. Her small hand reached, her voice soft but heavy with the weight of, why does Daddy hate? My breath caught, and the world seemed to fall. If she was old enough to see, it was as if she had taken a mirror, held it up to my face, forcing me. The innocence in her, the confusion etched into her little. I could bear the weight of Daniel's shoulders, making her carry what no child should ever have to carry. The days that followed were marked by a string of humiliations that seemed to pile higher with each passing moment. They weren't dramatic or loud. Daniel was far too skilled for that. Instead, they were quiet, sharp, precise, like paper cuts in places that never fully heal. At breakfast one morning, when I accidentally spilled coffee on the counter, he leaned in close and whispered, "You can't do anything right, can you?" His words were soft enough that our daughter, sitting across from us, didn't hear, but I felt them like a punch to the gut. That evening, while helping her with homework, I stumbled over a math problem. From across the room, Daniel chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as though my incompetence was a foregone conclusion. Each moment chipped away at me, but what made them unbearable was the knowledge that my daughter, even when the insults weren't directed, sensed the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that filled the room. Her laughter grew quieter, her eyes darted between us more often, and they sparkled at once. At night, when the house grew silent and Daniel fell asleep, I lay awake, muffled sob. I cried for the woman I used, the one who once believed. I cried for the little, and most of all, but crying inside, it wasn't loud or a whisper inside. They had piled up in embarrassmently, embarrassed that I spent so long pretending. That realization, yet anger began to, anger at Anger at myself, anger at the world. The fury wasn't destructive, though. It was clarifying. It reminded me that I wasn't powerless, that I still had choices, that I could still decide what story my daughter would grow up believing about her mother. Sadness still tugged at me in heavy waves. I mourned the dream I once had, the marriage I thought I had, the future I grieved for the version of who had once looked at me, though I now understood that version, and I grieved for the voice I had given. Tension in our home, but the more careful I became, the more he seemed to find ways. It was as though he thrived, and the truth was, shame clung to me, whispering veiled, not just for not protecting me, but within that shame, for the first time, the thought of leaving. If he cut me down, I would find my voice. I would fight back, not just for me. The decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with the choice to eat. But before I could summon the courage to speak, before I could release the words that had been building inside, Daniel stirred beside. His voice was low, and what he said, he murmured, almost casually, as though he were commenting, my breath catching. If this was his confession in the quiet, what other truths was he, and how much more was I? The same table where I was humiliated. After Daniel's late night, I don't love you anymore. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a dramatic fury or a sudden collapse of. It was quieter than that, steadier, but far more powerful. For years I had swallowed his words, silenced myself, convinced that endurance was the same as strength. But lying awake beside him that night, hearing those words whispered like an afterthought, I realized endurance was no longer survival. It was surrender, and I refused to surrender. The next day, I carried myself differently. It wasn't visible to anyone else, but I felt it in my bones, like a storm gathering strength just beneath. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what. I was tired of the whispers, tired of the mask we wore. Our daughter lived in the shadow. I decided that the same table cut me down, which I stood tall. Dinner that evening, the calm atmosphere, silverware clean, smell of roasted veg. Daniel sat across, smiling that, to anyone else, it would have looked like the. But I knew better, even if she. I waited until we were halfway through the. What are you talking about? His voice calmed. Instead, shock rippled through. Even after all these years, still hoped he might show us. But instead, he's tilting his head. You've been imagining things again, said, his tone dripping with. You really need to stop being so sensitive. Humiliation turned to my daughter, her little hands clutched. Sweetheart, do you remember what Daddy whispered? The word you repeated? Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though she wanted to answer but didn't know if. The tension in the room was suffocating. Daniel leaned. Don't drag her in, he said sharply, his tone edged. Embarrassment threatened his side. Times before. My cheeks burned, my throat tightened, and for a moment I thought I might shrink back into the silence he demanded. But then I saw my daughter's face, confused, scared, caught in the middle of a war she never asked to fight, and I knew I couldn't back down. Not this time. Anger surged through me, stronger than the humiliation, stronger than the fear. No, I said firmly, my voice rising for the first time. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to understand that words like they are not kind, they are cruelty. Daniel laughed then, a short, bitter sound like glass shattering. You're unbelievable. Always playing the victim, always looking for someone to blame. Maybe if you weren't so pathetic, I wouldn't have to say. The words stung, but something inside me shifted. Sadness no longer drowned. Instead, and I knew this was about whether she would. The tension at the table, every breath felt, every second. Why do you say mean things? You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, his tone sharp enough to. I reached for her hand, holding it tight, my eyes never leaving. For the first time, I didn't feel standing in the. He could deny, he could lash out, but I wasn't going to be silent. Then, just as I thought the confrontation had reached its breaking point, my daughter's voice cut through the tension. Her words were quiet, hesitant, but they hit me harder. Mommy, she asked softly, looking straight into my. Is it true Daddy said he doesn't love you? The room fell silent. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and Daniel's face drained. If she had overheard that truth, what else had she heard in the shadow? And how much longer could I from carrying the full weight of. When lies unravel, they don't just expose secrets. They reveal the true monster. The night my daughter asked if it was true that her father didn't love me, something inside me shifted permanently. There was no way to go back to the illusion. Years maintaining. She had seen too much, heard too much, and now the cracks in our marriage weren't just visible to me. They were bleeding into her innocence. But even as I braced myself to face the reality at home, I was still unprepared for what I was about to learn from the outside world. It started at a brunch with two of my closest friends, women who had known me since college, women who had seen me through heartbreaks and triumphs long before Daniel entered my life. We sat at a cozy cafe downtown, sunlight streaming through the windows, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries surrounding. For the first hour, everything felt normal, catching up on work, kids, the minutiae of life. But as the conversation shifted toward marriage and relationships, I noticed the way they exchanged glances, subtle and loaded, as if they were holding something. Finally, one of them leaned closer, voice dropping. I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but my stomach clenched as my hands tightening around. I overheard Daniel at a party he was with a group of guys, and she trailed off, her eyes searching mine, almost pleading with me not to break under the weight of what he was making jokes about, cruel one. Everyone laughed. Shock slammed. For years, his insults had hidden where undeniable. But now, hearing that he had carried those words out into the world, turned them into entertainment for others, made my blood run cold. It wasn't just cruelty anymore. Humiliation. I imagined the laughter of strangers as reduced me to embarrassment followed anything until now. Anger surged, hot and it wasn't just at him, though he deserved every. I was angry at myself for protecting him, for defending him, for sacrificing my dignity to preserve the marriage that didn't exist. I had handed him the power to destroy me, and he had wielded it without hesitation. The fury coursed through me like fire, burning away the last shreds of denial I had clung to. Sadness settled in after the anger, heavy and suffocating. I thought of the man I once believed in, the man I thought I had married. I thought of the promises he had made, the love he had pretended to give. None of it was real. The man I loved was gone, replaced by someone who not only whispered cruelty in private, but wore it proudly in public. It wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was a betrayal of everything I had. The tension between us grew unbearable. He greeted me with a speak, asked about my day, as though nothing. I looked at him and saw not just my husband, but the man who had turned me into. I forced myself to go through the motion, to tuck my daughter in, but inside, every word he spoke, every glance he gave, felt poisoned by the knowledge of what shame clung, but carried, and that meant one evening, how deep but then, buried in I thought insults were, she's pathetic. I don't know how much. Reading those white, stripped away, his whispers weren't just moments of cruelty. Our home. They were deliberate, consistent, and now I knew they were being shared with others, spread like poison beyond the walls of our house. But what I didn't realize that night was that the insults were only the beginning. The secrets hiding beneath them would cut even deeper. At first, I tried to stay calm. I told myself that I had survived his whispers, his mocking laughter, his public humiliation. Surely I could survive this too. But calmness was a fragile mask, and beneath it, shock churned violently. I had built my entire life around, built a family, built a home, and now I realized he was not only dismantling me, but destroying the very foundation of our marriage. His words weren't slips or they were truths he carried proudly into. Humiliation sank in like a. Every time I had stood beside him at parties, every time I had introduced, every time I had laughed, I had been the fool, the character he mocked behind. The thought of strangers' laugh, embarrassments, knowing I thought of my friends, not the kind that burned out, but the kind that tired of swallowing. If he could use words to cut, sadness still weighed on, especially when I thought about what did for our daughter. She had already absorbed, already learned to repeat his. I hated that her child, by the lies we told. I wanted her to grow up knowing. I stopped arguing. Phrases but soon I realized I was documented. For years he had, but with every word I wrote, I reclaimed a piece of myself. The notebook became my weapon, proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that his cruelty wasn't imagined. It was real, it was relentless, and now it was undeniable. Shame still haunted me. There were nights I stared at the notebook and wondered how I had allowed myself, how I had stayed silent for so. I thought of the strong, independent woman I used and felt a wave of regret crash over me. But shame no longer paralyzed me the way it once had. Instead, it pushed me toward empowerment. For the first time, I began to imagine what it would look like if the mask he wore slipped completely, if the world saw the man I lived with instead of the man he pretended. The thought terrified me, but it also thrilled me. I was no longer content. I was preparing myself to become. Then one evening, just as I was beginning to feel the first stirring, something unexpected happened. I was cleaning up the kitchen when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a number I recognized, but the message was short. You don't know everything about. You need to look deeper. I stared at the screen. It wasn't just me anymore. Someone else knew something. Someone was warning me. If his insults were only the surface, then what secrets lay hidden underneath, and who was about to help me uncover them? Silence is the ally of cruelty, and I realized too many people had been silent for too long. After receiving the anonymous message, you don't know everything about Daniel. You need to look deeper. I found myself replaying not only his words, but the countless interactions I had witnessed over the years with the people. It was one thing for Daniel to keep his cruelty hidden from the world, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth was never entirely. There had always been signs, subtle but and far too many people had. In calm moments, I thought back to family. My relatives would compliment how devoted he seemed, but sometimes, just sometimes, their smiles faltered when they. My sister once glanced at me with furrowed brows, made a dismissive joke at my, but she said nothing. My mother, who had been married to a man who raised his voice more often than his hand, had a way of going quiet when Daniel whispered something sharp to me in front of her. She never asked questions, never pressed, but her silence was loud enough to. Shock hit me as I realized how many people had chosen to look away. Neighbors who heard raised voices through, friends who saw the flicker of humiliation cross my face, relatives who heard the sharp in his tone when he thought no one. How many of them had chosen the over the discomfort victim of Daniel's embarrassment, twisting pain, made excuse, smiled through tears. I thought I was protected. Anger surged, anger at Daniel. Someone swallowed their discomfort. Sadness weighed heavily on. Had cost me years of my life, years I could have spent building something healthier, safer, stronger. It had cost my daughter her innocence, forcing her to grow up in a home where love and cruelty coexisted in ways that confused and wounded her. And it had cost me my voice, training me to believe that silence was the only option, that no one would stand with me. The tension between me and the world around me grew. Every interaction felt layered with when neighbors waved from when relatives smiled and I wondered if they, when friends, the weight of those I was the dude, and they were the silent. Shame crept in again, whispering that maybe they stayed silent, failed to give them a. Maybe my smiles and had convinced them. Maybe I had trained them, just as he had. That thought cut deep, because in many ways, my silence had given them. But from that shame rose and. If silence was the ally of cruelty, then my voice had to be. I couldn't rely on any. It had to start with me. I had to be the one to pull the mask off Daniel in front of the very people who defended him, stayed silent about. For the first time in years, I felt not just the weight of what had been lost, but the power of what I began to plan quietly, and I didn't know yet what secret the anonymous message, but I knew I couldn't wait for someone else to I had to take control of the narrative, to turn the whispers he used. The idea was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I wasn't going to be the silent. One night, as a notebook of documents, I flipped through the pages, and instead of crying, this wasn't just a record of it was evidence. It was truth, and I was ready to use it. For years, Daniel had and for years, but that silence was. I was done. As I closed the notebook, the table, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I was going to expose him publicly, and once the truth was out, there would be no going back. For years, he controlled the story. Now, it was my turn to write the ending. The night I decided to expose Daniel publicly, something inside me settled with an unfamiliar calm. It wasn't the hollow calm of resignation or silence. It was the calm that comes before a storm, the kind that carries power instead of fear. For years, I had allowed him to shape the narrative of our marriage, to wear his mask of charm for the world, while whispering cruelty into the shadows of our home. But I had finally reached the point where I understood that survival meant more than endurance. It meant taking back control of the story he had stolen from me. The shock of that realization left me reeling at first. I had grown so accustomed to shrinking beneath his whispers, to convincing myself that staying quiet was the safest choice, that imagining myself as the one who would expose him felt almost surreal. But the longer I sat with the thought, the stronger it grew, until it no longer felt like an option. Humiliation had followed me, every insult, every denial. But when I looked back at those, I saw something, proof that his wasn't a figment of my deliberate and what once silenced me, because I realized embarrassment, what mattered more. It wasn't the kind, enough confidence, enough dignity. I refused to let him. I wanted him to. Sadness still. From my notebook, the cruel note I had found in his jacket, the testimonies from friends who had overheard his mocking words. Piece by piece, I assembled the story he had written with his cruelty, only now it was mine to tell. Shame tried to creep in as I prepared, whispering that maybe I was going too far, that maybe I was stooping to his level. But I reminded myself that shame was his tool, not mine. He had used it to silence me, keep me small. Now I was stripping it away. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. And with that thought came empowerment, bright and unshakable. For the first time in years, I felt strong, not because I was enduring his cruelty, but because I was preparing to end it. Every document I saved, every piece of evidence I gathered, every step I took toward the truth gave me back a piece of the woman I had. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was teaching my daughter that silence was not survival, that her mother had a voice, she would use it. The plan was simple but bold. I would expose him in front of the very people who had admired him, the ones who had believed in his mask. Family, friends, co-workers, everyone who thought they knew. If silence had been his greatest weapon, then public truth. I didn't know exactly how they would read, but I knew one thing for certain. Once the truth was out, I chose the dinner carefully. It wasn't just any dinner. It was a gathering Daniel himself had, a chance for him to shine in front of people. He had invited colleagues, relatives, neighbors, eager to show up. And I agreed, smiling as I nodded, hiding the storm that was already building inside. The night of the dinner, I moved through the house, setting the table, arranging the food, greeting guests. Daniel was in his element, laughing, pouring drinks, charming everyone with ease. To them, it was just another evening of celebration, another glimpse into the perfect life. To me, it was the battlefield where I would finally reach. As I watched him from across the room, I felt my heart, not with fear this time. Every laugh he elicited, every smile I knew what they didn't know. When everyone was seated at the table, Daniel raised. His words were smooth. He thanked everyone for coming, spoke of family, and as I listened, he had no idea tonight Daniel was walking straight into the trap I had built for him. The moment the mask fell, the man I married ceased to exist, and everyone finally saw the truth. The night of the dinner began with the same polished calm that had defined every gathering. Our dining room glowed warmly. Daniel thrived in this environment, his voice carrying with his gestures. He poured wine, pulled out chairs, leaned in to listen as every word spoke. Watching him, you would have thought he was the perfect husband, the perfect man. But as I sat there, my daughter at my side, the notebook of truth heavy in my mind, if not in my hand, I felt the tension simmer beneath. Calm was no longer submission, it was strategy. I knew what was coming, even if no one else. Tonight was not about enduring tonight was about ending it. Shock rippled through me even as I prepared, because part of me still couldn't. For years I had the smiling one, the woman who allowed. Now here I was, ready to turn lies into revelation. The enormity of what but it no longer. Daniel began his toast, raising his smile. He spoke of gratitude. His words dripped with sin. I watched the faces around. Humiliation tried. The old voice whispering I was about to destroy, but I shoved it aside. Humiliation. When he finished, the clink echoed. Say something. Daniel's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. My hands trembling. Gasps filled. Forks clattered. One by one, anger built in me. For years he had punchline while they laughed, charming them into silence while I suffered alone. But tonight, my voice filled the room, my anger no longer hidden but laid bare for everyone to see. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his smirk cracking, his mask slipping. Sadness tugged at me when I glanced at my daughter, her wide eyes fixed on me, confusion and fear mingling in her gaze. I hated that she had to witness this, hated that her childhood had been poisoned by whispers, but I also knew she needed that silence was the tension in the room grew. Daniel finally, this is ridiculous. She's always been dramatic, always twisting things. His eyes darted around instead of nods. His voice was louder, the whispers that had shadows finally but instead of shrinking, not through the man they thought they, and for the first time, it was silent in wrath. Daniel's face flushed, how quickly the tide had turned again. You'll regret this? He spat, his voice venom. You think you've won, but you haven't. And with that, he stormed out, the door slamming rattled the walls, leaving the room thick with stun. But his final words echoed as if he was vowing revenge. Then the real the man who once made me, now stood powerless. The night of the undid, with Daniel's face red with rage, his mask shattered. For years he had their admiration, but now they felt the venom behind, watched the mask slip, and for the first time, the one left powerless. He was. The calm that followed surprised me. I had expected chaos, backlash, maybe even regret, but instead I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. The silence around the table wasn't aimed at me anymore. It was aimed at him. The people who once laughed at his jokes and praised his charm now sat stunned, their faces pale, their admiration turned into something colder. Daniel's power had always relied on their belief, and in one night I had taken that belief away. Shock rippled through me in the days that followed, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. No one called to defend him. No one reached out to excuse his behavior. Instead, I received quiet messages of support. Friends who admitted they had suspected something was wrong. neighbors who confessed they had overheard things through the walls, relatives who apologized for their silence. For years, I had been the one carrying the weight of his cruelty alone, but now the burden was shifting. The truth had freed me, and it had chained him. Humiliation no longer belonged. It was his. I watched as the respect he had hoarded for years. His co-workers no longer invited. His friends grew when he tried to even his family, who had once praised him and began to question every whispered embarrassments, but it wasn't as suffocating, and in doing so had shifted the balance. For once, anger simmered beneath. It wasn't wild or I wasn't angry at for enduring. I was angry at him for the years he had, the innocence he had, the dignity, but this anger gave me clarity. It reminded me why I couldn't let this. Sadness crept in when I saw. She didn't fully understand, but she felt the shift. Her father no longer carried the same glow and no longer seemed untouched. She asked fewer questions about him, clung to me more often, and I mourned the fact by betrayal rather. Yet even in that sadness, because she had also seen me fight, me refuse to stay, and I knew those less witnessed. The tension in the air remained, though. Daniel didn't vanish after. He lingered like a storm on the horizon, his absence louder than his presence. I knew he was wounded, humiliated, stripped of the identity he valued more than anything, and I knew a man like him wouldn't let that. Each day I braced myself, waiting for his retaliation, unsure of when or how it. Shame still whispered in dark corners, reminding me of the years I had lost, the silence I had, the moments I had, but instead of drowning in it, shame became a reminder of who I would never again be the one. That woman was gone. He no longer held the image was broken. I was not the one weakened, and the more powerless he, but empowered because even as I stood there, even as the balance shifted, I couldn't shake. Daniel was not the type of man. His identity had on admiration. Stripped of all of that, he was dangerous and cornered, desperate, unpredictable. And my fear was confirmed when, late one evening, I overheard a conversation he didn't know I could hear. His voice was low, urgent, laced with venom. If she thinks she's won, she's wrong. My blood ran cold. If he was already planning something desperate, then the battle wasn't over. The darkest chapter was still to come. When you reclaim your voice after years of silence, it doesn't just free you, it teaches your child what real strength. After overhearing Daniel's threat, I knew the end of our story was approaching. For years, I had lived in fear of his whispers, his cruelty, his control. But now the fear felt different. It wasn't the kind that made me small. It was the kind that sharpened me, that reminded me the time for silence. His vow to make me regret exposing him didn't paralyze. It pushed me toward the one decision I had been for far too long. It was time to choose freedom. The calm that settled over me as I surprised me. I thought leaving would feel chaotic, terrifying, but instead it felt like breathing for the first time in years. I started small, moving important documents into a safe place, setting aside money he didn't know about, building a plan piece. Each step made me stronger. Each choice a reminder that I wasn't powerless anymore. Shock still rippled through me sometimes, usually at night when I thought back to the early days of our marriage. How had we gone from love and laughter to cruelty and threats? How had I once believed his charm was real, when now I could see it was only a mask? The shock wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, about how much I had endured, about how long I had stayed silent. But instead of letting it break me, I let it remind me of how far humiliation no longer haunted. There were moments I wished, the insults I had, the times I had lied, the years I had pretended to the world. But now I understood that humiliation had only lived. By speaking the truth, by exposing him, I had stripped humiliation. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was his. Embarrassment lingered, especially when people had seen me believing our life. But even that embarrassed as I realized how much support friends reached out, neighbors offered, relatives apologized. I wasn't standing alone. Anger carried me through kind that gave me and sadness still visited. I mourned the love. We sat at the same table where, only this time, I'm leaving. For the first time, he didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his face pale. The power he once held had slipped. Shame still tried to whispering that leaving meant failure, that I had broken that I had given up. Staying silent for you. Leaving was not weakness. It was strength. It was survival. It was freedom. Empowerment washed over me. Walked out the door with my daughter by my side. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about reclaiming myself. It was about showing my daughter that silence is not strength, that cruelty is not love, that endurance is not survival. It was about teaching her that her mother had a voice, and that voice could not be silenced anymore. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's social collapse deepened. His colleagues distanced themselves. His friends disappeared. His family turned inward, unsure of how to reconcile the man they thought with the truth they now saw. He tried, of course, to smear me, to twist the story, to reclaim control. But the truth had already spread too far, and his words no longer carried. For every lie he told, I had proved. For every attempt at control, I had already built a shield. His power was gone. Justice didn't come in a single dramatic, came slowly, in courtrooms where it spoke louder than his. In custody agreement, put our daughters safe. In the steady unraveling of the life he had once controlled. Each step toward justice was another step toward freedom, another layer of empowerment. My daughter began to heal too. At first she struggled, caught between the love she wanted from her father and the cruelty she. But as time passed, she began to see. She saw that love was not built on but on words of laughter. She saw me not as a victim, someone who had broken in her healing. But slowly, I learned to laugh, not with forced smile. Tears filled my eyes, but this time, because I knew she would. And in reclaiming my voice, I hadn't just free. I had shown her what real strength, and that more than anything. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit like so it reaches someone else who might need the courage tonight, and share your own turning point in the comments. The moment you knew silence had to end. Subscribe for more powerful first-person justice stories, and ring the bell so you never miss the next. And if you know someone who needs a voice matters, share this video with them too.